situation worse.
Don't poke the beast. Copenhagen. We agreed 2 degrees.
Yes, in Copenhagen we all signed up, of course not legally binding, but I mean we still promised, and I think promises are quite important. Our commitment was to sign up to stay below 2 degrees centigrade, in fact to take action necessary to stay below 2 degrees C. Now it wasn't a 50-50 chance of 2 degrees C or a 75% chance of exceeding 2 degrees C, it was to stay below, and it was to do it consistent with science and on the basis of equity. So we then start thinking, well, how does that play out? Well, firstly, what we have in Paris, even when we go into Paris, the submissions to Paris, the INDCs, are for well above 2 degrees centigrade, are in the 3 to 4 degrees C temperature range. So that's the first thing.
And that's with BECS.
That's with BECS. So lower end, that is definitely with BECS, but possibly even the upper end. So we're aiming at 3 to 4, going by the INDCs that we're submitting. The second is they're supposed to be consistent with science. They have no basis in science. They're just voluntary contributions that leaders of countries have said, this is what we'll do. And of course you have to check the detail, because we don't always trust our leaders of all countries.
Surely some mistake.
Yes. So there's that, and then the final one is actually on the basis of equity. When you look at that, what you still see is the rich parts of the world are taking an unfair proportion of whatever carbon budget they think they should go for. They are allocating a larger slice of that carbon budget to their rich countries, which means the poorer countries get less. So it is not consistent with 2 degrees C, it's not in line with the science, and it's not on the basis of equity. So we've failed on all the 3 fundamental points that we were signed up to in Copenhagen, and that we've signed up to pretty much every single year since, including our current Prime Minister in the UK, who signed the Camp David Agreement.
Why are you going to Paris?
One of the reasons I'm going is that it's nearby. So I don't go to many of the COP. I've only been to one so far, these big international negotiations.
You went to Warsaw, didn't you?
I went to Warsaw because I can get there by train. So I'm going to Paris because it's easy for me to get to. So if it was a long way, I don't think I could justify the carbon emissions. But I'm going to Paris. We're involved with lots and lots of events when we're there. So myself and other colleagues, there's only myself and 2 of us going from Manchester, but other colleagues in the Tyndall Centre are going. And we've tried to fill up our time with events and speaking events and attending on panel sessions and so forth whilst we're actually in Paris. But I'm not going there with some misguided view that I'm going to significantly change, or people like me are going to significantly change the outcome of Paris. In effect, if you're going to go to the Paris negotiations, what you're talking about is the post-Paris discussions.
Okay, so what should we be doing in 2016 after the world leaders have had their photo op and made their promises based on BECS? As citizens, as scientists, however you want to answer that question, Kevin.
Oh, crikey. Well, as I said before, I think that Paris is pretty much the end game for even a very slim probability of 2 degrees centigrade. I think we pretty much, if we don't get a decent deal out of Paris, then it's pretty much gone. Having said that, we have to be quite careful. So anyway, if it's a week after Paris, or a month after Paris, or 6 months after Paris, well, these are still very important periods where we could be pushing very hard. And to me, if we think 2 degrees C centigrade is what we should be aiming for, or ideally lower, in my view, as a citizen, but that's the best we can hope for now, it's incumbent on us to be pushing as hard as we possibly can. We should have been doing that beforehand, but we clearly haven't been pushing hard enough for any of our governments to submit a contribution to Paris that is in line with 2 degrees centigrade, even though they all pretend that they are broadly in line. So it is absolutely incumbent on those of us who think it's important to deal with climate change to be pushing every lever we possibly can to try to tighten up whatever comes out of Paris, because almost certainly what comes out of Paris will not be enough for 2 degrees centigrade. I still think though that the chances of succeeding now are incredibly slim. So we must also think the other part of the dialogue, which is not what I get engaged with significantly, but is the idea of adaptation, of loss and damage. And my one concern about loss and damage is that it's been hijacked by this discussion around 100 billion per year.
Yeah.
I mean, I find that almost insulting. That I don't know.
As in it's a trivial sum of money.
It's a trivial sum of money, and then that means a very clever technique. You use a trivial sum of money, and then you create arguments about the trivial sum of money. But actually, the real issue is shouldn't that amount of money be 100 times more, or 10 times more, or some order of magnitude different from where it is today? When you think of 100, we're talking about 100 million. It's 100 million. So $100 billion dollars, as well as my understanding. Is that yours as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, $100 billion. So
which they're not anywhere near pledging.
But they're not near achieving that. And what's $100 billion relative to the UK GDP? That's, I don't know exactly, but it's probably it's probably less than the 15th of the UK GDP. So the adaptation funds for the rest of the world to deal with the climate change that we in the wealthy world primarily have caused, we are handing out less than 1/15 of the UK GDP to the rest of the world. You start to think of that in terms of, how many years' salary is that for all the Premiership Division football players? Not very many. That's how important we think this is to the other parts of the world. It is an almost irrelevant sum of money compared with the scale of the challenge that we are knowingly handing to them. So I think there are those two parts of this. One, we need to be pushing for mitigation like there's no tomorrow, but we should have been doing that for a long time, and we have not been pushing hard enough. And the NGO community, the scientific community have been
But Cameron, who do we push? Because Cameron is part of the EU negotiating bloc and isn't listening anyway.
No.
The people in the Manchester City Council is failing on all its goals and isn't part of the Paris stuff anyway. So who am I supposed to send an angry letter to?
Well, the first people I think we need to push are ourselves. We have been far too complacent.
I couldn't agree with you
more. The NGOs have been too complacent.
You have no idea how much trouble I get into with social movement colleagues when I point to the fact. But we're now in Paris. Who do I send a letter to?
Well, as I said, the first thing is we must no longer be co-opted. Those people who think it's a really important issue, we must no longer be co-opted by this is the best that we can achieve in the current paradigm. We have to question that paradigm. So
of growth.
Yes, growth is just one word to explain it, but broadly, yes, the contemporary economic paradigm whereby we use huge quantities of fossil fuels to have this form of existence that we have today is completely incompatible in the short to medium term with dealing with climate change around the 2 degrees C framing. I think that is just a matter of simple mathematics, unless you assume Bex is going to solve the problem for you.
So I can I can get my hair shirt out of the closet, and I can minimise my consumption.
It's a very yesterday way of looking at it. At first, I would not think of it as getting a hair shirt. There are many people around the globe who have to wear when they dream of the good days when you can wear a hair shirt. They would like to have. So in a sense, what we're saying is the very wealthy of us that have caused the problem will have to take a significant hit in the short to medium term.
I was being flippant, obviously, but. Partly to do with the fact that I've been reading a lot of the 25-30 year history of the promises made by politicians, the protests made by the activists, the warnings made by the climate scientists, and they're all talking past each other, and there seems to, not listening to each other, and there seem to be no levers that people of good faith, whether they're scientists, politicians, citizens, are able to pull or push or whatever you do with a lever that moves the juggernaut or even slows down the acceleration of the juggernaut.
Well, there are two things about that. First, I think we have to think differently about our metaphors. But actually, I probably disagree with the first part of what you said then. I don't think we are talking past each other. This is my concern, is I think actually we have increasingly used a similar language. We have come to a consensus of apathy.
Consensus of apathy, I love it. I love the concept, not the fact that we live in a consensus of apathy.
And I think, so in a sense, we have all been co-opted. The scientific community, the NGO community, the political movements. And then this is partly Klein's argument, as I understand it. Naomi Klein's argument. And I don't agree with everything that Naomi Klein has to say, but I think it's a really important part of the argument here is that we have been happy to be invited to the table, but we've been invited to the table because we're going to have the same manners as everyone else there. But those manners require us to sort of hold to a particular agenda, and actually what we were thinking about before was a completely different agenda. And we've been prepared to park that one because we're allowed to speak at that table. And that has been incredibly... Well, you can see why it's attractive to be there, but by the time you've got there, you've given away so many of your principles, there's nothing left. There's nothing significant that you bring to the table, new, different. So I think... So I disagree with the idea with talking past each other. We have actually, unfortunately, we've honed in on a set of languages that we are all happy and comfortable with. And I do not think that's... Well, I know then that's not in line with what we need to do in terms of 2 degrees centigrade. And therefore, one of the things we need to do in Paris is to open that up again, is to start to be much more, to be led by our principles, by our understanding of the science, not to be led by what is politically acceptable, what you can get published, what other people want to hear. Also, in terms of climate science, whether our conclusions are liked or disliked is irrelevant.
Then you become a voice in the wilderness. If the chair of the World Coal Association, Benjamin Sporton, was sat here, the word he would use is realistic. I mean, he's pushing the argument that only coal can provide the energy for South Asia's economic growth. And the word that keeps coming up is realistic, pragmatic. And these are the key words.
I get that regularly. I mean, on tweets and in emails. Realistic. Firstly, I don't think the future is realistic. Whichever way you go, you either mitigate, and any way that you mitigate for 2 degrees C, that is going to look unrealistic with the lens that we currently use to look at the world we live in. But then you start saying, well, let's not mitigate for 2 degrees C, and we're on a slim chance of that now anyway. So let's imagine living in a 4 degrees C world. With any lens you look at 4 degrees C world, well, that's not realistic either. So in a sense, what we want is some, realism is a problem. We need to start to think very differently about where we're heading, because the future is radically different from the present. Either way.
That's another question that someone has asked me to ask you. Is like, well, we'll get your crystal ball out.
Yeah.
What changes do we expect? Is it food prices going up? Is it wetter winters? It's the future, so how can you predict? But
if only it was just food prices going up and some slightly wetter winters. It depends. For whom again?
Okay, well...
if you're one of the 30 million people living on the coastal strip of Bangladesh within 1 metre of sea level rise and increased severity of typhoons and possibly increased frequency of typhoons going forward, then you start to think, well, that is going to become really problematic. So is it realistic for them? Are we asking about what sort of world they're going to live in? Or are we asking what the impact's going to be like for us? Rich, wealthy people in the Northern Hemisphere, and clearly not everyone in the Northern Hemisphere is rich and wealthy, but those of us that are, we think we can get by. Broadly, that's what we're saying here. We think we've got the wherewithal to build big enough walls to deal with 2 degrees C. We think we might have big enough walls to deal with sort of 2.5, 3 degrees C, and you get the sort of Matt Ridleys of this world and the Nigel Lawsons who would suggest that the wealthy of us probably have enough wherewithal to build a wall for 4 degrees C or so, and they'll say that perhaps other parts of the world can do that as well, but I think they fully understand that they're not going to be able to have that wherewithal to protect themselves. So what we have to be very careful about who is the we in this. So with the head of the coal,
World Coal Association.
The World Coal Association, I would ask about whose realism is he talking about? Is he talking about the poor people who would be impacted by climate change, or is he talking about the richer people who will benefit from in the short term from the continued burning of coal? Which group is he talking about?
If I get an interview with him, I'll ask him on your behalf.
So I think we have to be very careful about this idea of realism. Almost if someone says, "Oh, that's not realistic," then it's got a reasonable chance of success. If someone looks at you and thinks, "Well, that looks quite a viable option," I'm more sceptical of that now. We've got to ourselves to a position whereby the future is so different from the present, will be so different from the present either way, that we have to start to think differently, and that's quite challenging for us. That's why I always finish off my talks with the Robert Unger quote about we need more imagination, but we need clarity as well. Imagination isn't enough. We have to imagine what the new future might look like, and the clarity is trying to provide some sort of some structure to what that would be in a more tangible sense, but also how you would get there as well. So those two go hand in hand. Imagination is not enough. You do require that clarity, and that's our job. For those of us who think this is serious, so you ask me, what do we do after Paris? It's both of those. It's imagination and clarity, but it's also courage. And you say, are we just voices in the wilderness? But not if there are lots of us. There are lots of people then. Firstly, I think that the orthodoxy, the establishment has moved on. And I think Paris will be a different event to that we saw in Copenhagen. So I think that the door is very slightly ajar. And there are, the rest of us who are outside of that door, I think there's scope for us now to make enough collective noise that we can start to prise that door open a bit further. And that's that slim little bit of hope that I have, that things are coming together, almost too late though, but on the sufficient degree of scientific uncertainty that we might just have an opportunity to prise that door open and actually start to make some more fundamental, profound changes that would be needed for 2 degrees C temperature rises.
You'll be happy to know only 2 more questions. So one of them is there a country or a region that you can point to that is doing things in the right direction, if not at the right speed and scale?
No, I don't think there is. Having said that,
I was afraid you'd say that.
Well, having said that, I'm saying this with a very big caveat that it's not something I've looked at in detail. But I have colleagues of mine who look at these curves of quality of life. Now, they're very indices you can use. There are lots of ways of measuring it, and they pretty much all show the same thing, regardless of which methodology you use, is that you increase your energy consumption and your well-being, your quality of life goes up. And you can measure that through life expectancy and all those other usual things that you.
But then there's diminishing returns.
Well, at some point there isn't actually any diminishing returns. There is no return.
Yeah.
I mean and you hit some sort of point on the curve.
So this is the spirit level argument.
Like the spirit level argument, but that's been done by a colleague of mine here, William Lamb's working on this, but lots of people have worked on this for a long time, and I think it's a fairly robust assessment that's been made. Almost all indices that you can look at would tend to suggest that you get this little sort of golden circle of countries, and I think, as I recall, there might be about a dozen countries there, and there are places like Costa Rica that are in there. So if you really wanted to go and look at countries where you might get some very useful lessons from, and I think we have to be very careful to say that, these are the ideal countries, because I have no idea what their political frameworks may well be. There may be lots of issues to do with freedoms and all sorts of other things that are wrapped up there. I'm not aware of those, and not things I've engaged with. But nevertheless, there are a small sweet spot of countries that do seem to have, in the normal set of indices we use for quality of life, high quality of life, and relatively low emissions. Nowhere near low enough emissions for 2 degrees centigrade, but a very good sort of indicator group of countries about, what would we need to do to have qualities of life, which we then, if we actually superimpose on top of that a strong mitigation agenda, both on the supply side and the demand side, if you put those two together, could you actually start to see a society that was very low carbon, in line with 2 degrees C? And I think that would be an interesting thing to test. And the sense I get is that you probably could start to see something there. But if you think there's a country out there that's doing it, you can just go and look at them and learn from them. Yeah, well, not one on this planet anyway.
We're deep into the bargaining phase. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Anything else you'd like to say? Traditionally, that's my last question.
Oh, is it? No, it's the most difficult question of all. Well, my final comment is that actually I don't like pessimism and I don't like optimism. I like realism, which, as I say, as an engineer, to me feels that's what engineers are supposed to do, supposed to have as their sort of as their raison d'être, really. And realistically, we could still just about hold to 2 degrees centigrade, but not if we sit still, not if we continue to be co-opted. We will have to pull out all stops to hold to 2 degrees centigrade. I think we should park the naive optimism of things like BECS. We still have them there. Some people should work on them. I'm not disagreeing with that. Some people should work on them. But the rest of us, I think, need to be thinking about how do we deal with this problem if that doesn't exist. And that means we have to start to ask those questions that we have been too scared to ask for the last 10 years now. So the other knob is for the short-term reductions that are necessary are these social, political, economic
politically
challenges.
Unpalatable, courageous things. So, for example, Ed Miliband and David Miliband were flying a kite about personal carbon allowances. This was about 10 years ago.
Yes, yeah, they were indeed. Yeah, when David Miliband was very much in favour of it as an idea, and then was very interested in it as an idea, and he asked DEFRA to analyse it, and they said it was a policy before its time. I think they were wrong then, but maybe its time's come now. We need to be asking those sorts of questions. Is that a policy tool that we should seriously be considering? Should we be having standards that maybe, is it reasonable that people own 2 or 3 houses and drive very large cars and have private jets and travel first class in a world that is trying to deal with 2 degrees centigrade? Now, I'm not saying those are bad or good things outside of climate change. We can make our own judgments on that. But from a climate change perspective, they all require or end up producing large quantities of CO2. Whilst trying to deal with climate change, is it appropriate that those sorts of practices go on? These are very difficult questions. As you sit there, listen to the news in the evening about another football player having his salary negotiated, or about some tennis star and what she's going to get paid now, or someone in film, or someone in business. When you look at the amounts of money they're talking about, that money reflects very much in terms of their carbon emissions, and they're still things that we're aspiring to. That form of society is not compatible with the 2 degrees C framing. And now I'm not saying that once we've got low carbon energy supply in place, we can go back to the sorts of lives that we lead today and the sorts of structures we have today. But if we're serious about 2 degrees C, it begs those sorts of profound questions about positional goods, aspirations, the things that our society appears to aim to try to achieve and that it says are good. I think we have to park those temporarily, at least whilst we get low carbon energy supply in place. Challenging. But challenging but doable, I think, is what I would suggest.
And cut. Hopefully it was still recording.
Yeah, I was in the screen.
Yes, it was. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much,
My pleasure.
Kevin. That was really excellent.